So for those who do not know me, my name is Heather Wardrope and I'm an alumni engagement officer here at Robert Gordon's University, and I've been so for the last 3 years. And today I am joined by Joanna. Now, Joanna graduated with us with us in 2019 with a BA Honours in social work, and has since then have gone through different kind of roles within the social worker kind of industry and sector. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask you, Joanna, what made you pick social work? Like, why go down that road when you were picking a uni course? What was the inspiration behind it?
Yeah, so for me, I guess it kind of stemmed from, I always knew that I wanted to work with people. Initially, I thought about maybe doing psychology, but again, when I was thinking about kind of employment prospects and things like that, I kind of had a hunch that, once I'd graduated from psychology, it's likely that I would then go on to maybe do a postgrad in something like social work. It was actually when I went to the RG Open Day and sat in on the social work talk that was when I made up my mind that it was social work that I wanted to apply for. So yeah, from then on, it was just social work degrees I applied for. I didn't actually look for anything else. So yeah, again, it just stemmed from a desire to work with people and kind of do meaningful work with them.
And then during your time at Robert Gordon's University, did you do quite a lot of placements? Like, how did you find your journey at Robert Gordon's? Anything, like any moments stand out to you?
Yeah, so I think at RGU you're really lucky because you get 3 different placements. So I mean, I know at other universities you get the same amount of practice learning hours, but RGU it's split into 3 placements, which is nice because you get 3 different experiences. So I guess for me, my placements kind of happened in a more unusual way. Normally your first placement or 2 will be voluntary, less statutory, less legal element to it. And then your final placement is more statutory, whereas mine kind of happened the other way around. My first placement was care management for older people, and that was with Aberdeenshire Council. So that was, working with incapacity, adults with maybe dementia, who had physical care needs, doing care plans and things like that. And then my second placement was children and families. So that was kind of child protection work. And I guess for me, that was probably the placement that stood out the most. That's where I really sparked my interest in young people, children and families. And even the role I'm in now, substance misuse, it was so prevalent in my role as, in children and families team. And I ended up doing my dissertation kind of on that area. So yeah, I think that was definitely probably the placement that helped me kind of know exactly what it was I wanted to do. And then my final placement was actually voluntary. It was with Advocacy Aberdeen. So rather than having kind of, I suppose, a social work hat on, you were going in from an advocacy perspective. But I do think that on the flip side, although I had to kind of take my social work hat off in order to do the advocacy role, it was really good that I had the knowledge of a lot of statutory processes from my previous 2 placements, which I could then use to kind of support the clients that I was advocating for in my final placement. So I loved all my placements, but I think definitely my second one probably is what helped me to really figure out where my interests really were and helped me to kind of know for sure what kind of line of work I wanted to go into after I graduated.
So you've mentioned that in your first placement that you worked quite a bit with older people with dementia. So for those who don't know me, my background's in events, so I don't really have a strong understanding or knowledge in these sectors. But my understanding is when you're working with people like dementia, or you're working in with older people, or in any sector really, there's a lot of like cross collaboration with other kind of sectors, so like occupational therapists, mental health possibly. How does that really affect like your kind of day-to-day work? And do you find there's a lot of collaboration there, or is it still kind of quite segregated, quite kind of like this is this kind of thing?
I think interagency working and collaboration is absolutely at the core of everything that we do, and not just in adult services with older people, but across any social work field. The health and social care partnerships were kind of introduced, which really integrated health services and social care services. So yeah, I think it would be really extremely difficult to carry out your social work care management role without your colleagues in occupational therapy, physiotherapy, GPs, carers, nursing staff, all of that. It's totally essential so that you can create the holistic and actually materialize the plan that you're trying to achieve for clients. So yeah, I think in my experience, interagency working has been really positive. I think it depends on how ingrained those processes are in different local authorities, because I've worked for different local authorities since I graduated, so you can kind of compare where you can see that processes are much smoother in some local authorities, and they're much more used to working in that sort of collaborative way in comparison to maybe other local authorities where it's maybe less ingrained in their procedures. So yeah, I think information sharing is kind of at the core of that as well. It's balancing confidentiality, GDPR, with your kind of duty to actually work collaboratively, because a lot of it is kind of enshrined in legislation now as well. So there is actually legal duties to work collaboratively when you're providing a service. So yeah, it benefits the client and it makes your work a lot easier where you have really established interagency relationships with other disciplines.
I don't know if you will know this, but because like there is such a kind of crossover between certain areas, do you ever get people switching industry, like sectors, like from going from, again, I don't know how feasible this is, but going from like say occupational therapy into social work, or social work going into occupational health kind of thing? Is there a jump around, or are you kind of more kind of set that this is what you do?
I think there definitely is scope for that. And I think especially in adult services, I know like my title is Care Manager and I'm social work qualified Care Manager, but care management can also be open to people with a nursing background as well. I saw in the chat that somebody is, starting care management from a nursing background. So that's really common. And in children's services as well, you see people who have maybe come into children and families teams. Maybe they've done support work and they then become qualified and work in children and family social work teams. So I think, yeah, because you get that exposure to other disciplines and other roles, people can use that to then further their own career and kind of maybe change career paths slightly. So yeah, it does definitely make it easier to do that because you kind of have that scope that you maybe wouldn't have had before. Collaborative working was so kind of enshrined in policy at the moment.
Perfect. And then I'm just kind of going through like your bio again. So after you graduated, you went you began working as a through care and aftercare social worker. Can you tell us a bit more about that, and for my benefit, what that actually means? I'm sure most of you guys out there do know what it means, but I have no idea. So if you just let us know a bit more about that kind of experience.
Yeah, so through care aftercare is basically the social work kind of area that works with young people specifically who have been in the care system and are kind of come into that transitional sort of period where they're coming into adulthood. So it is part of children's services, although we don't just work with children. We kind of start working with young people at about age 15. We start doing a bit of kind of preparing them for leaving care, that sort of work, and then they're entitled to a service from through care aftercare until the age of 26. So we can have people on your, as a through care aftercare worker, you can have people on your caseload from 15 up until 26 years of age. So it's a bit of a grey area because it is part of children's services, because it comes, the need for that service comes from the fact that children are looked after and need an aftercare support service. But yeah, you do work under kind of adults processes as well as part of that. So definitely an interesting area of practice because you're kind of in this middle ground where you're balancing your children's service responsibilities and some adult responsibilities as well. You can become involved in adult support and protection processes once young people are over 15. If they're kind of at high risk, they don't actually fall under that legislation anymore for child protection. So you're working through adult support and protection policies and procedures under a children's service. So yeah, it's a very interesting area of practice, and you do get exposure to a lot of different processes because it is in that kind of grey area, in that transitional period between, I guess, childhood and adulthood, which is obviously really crucial for young people.
Was there anything during that kind of work experience for you that you enjoyed the most, or what did you find most challenging throughout that time as being a through care and aftercare social worker?
I think the areas that I enjoyed the most was probably watching, because it was just under 2 years I was there. So the people I had on my caseload were allocated to me for the entirety of that time. So it's kind of the reward of seeing where they started. You meet them whilst they're still in care, they're still kind of in this child's role, and you kind of work alongside them in partnership with them as they move into adulthood. So when you learn what their goals are, what their aims are, and when young people are able to achieve it, and you can see that they've kind of started to successfully move through that transition, that's probably my favorite part, because at the end of the day, that's kind of what you come into social work for. It's to see people achieving their goals, and yeah, helping them alongside that. The challenges and the parts that were most difficult for me in that role was probably, I guess most people, if you're social work students, you'll know that there's a stigma that comes with being a social, I mean, there's stigma for our clients for being open to social work services, but there's also stigma around being a social worker itself, I feel. And a lot of young people, especially if they've been in care for the majority of their life, by the time they get to through care, aftercare services, they're quite burnt out of social work. They're quite resistant to that support. They've maybe not had great experiences of social work in care, out of care. And so a lot of them are reluctant to kind of engage meaningfully. So that can be really difficult, because you as a social worker, you can spot potential in people. You kind of have creative ideas about what you could do to support that person to reach their goals, or even just to identify their goals if they're in a stage where they don't actually really know what they want and what the future looks like for them. It's really difficult to do that where there's that barrier between you and the client, because they're so reluctant. It's even just having a social work title can be a deterrent for some clients. I used to always say, with a couple of clients in particular, if only I wasn't a social worker and they didn't know that that was my role, we probably would get so much further in our work together. So I think, yeah, the title of being a social worker can be really off-putting for clients, and it's a massive kind of piece of work to overcome a whole kind of cultural view and, yeah, the stigma of social work in just your role on your own. So it's kind of chipping away at people's views and trying to, yeah, change their mind a wee bit and help them to see how the sport could benefit them. But yeah, that's definitely the biggest challenge, is engaging people who possibly are fed up of social work and don't really want to be engaged.
Do you think there's a way to, like, you're talking about like chipping away and kind of changing what being a social worker means to people? What do you think is the best way to really do that? Because, like, I understand there is a bit of stigmatism around it. Like, if you, it's almost like a threatening thing. Like, you hear people, oh, I'll get the police on you, I'll get the social workers on you, kind of thing. It's almost like you get the bad rap kind of for it, but you're there to help, you're there to support. So what do you think is the way to get out of that kind of stigmatism?
I think for me, and I've done this through all my placements and all my roles as social worker, is transparency is key. I think clients really respect and appreciate transparency. So I'm not a believer in processes going on behind clients' backs. Like, if someone's open to ASP, adult support protection, that can be kept quite hush for a while and people don't want to tell the client. But I always just tell the client up front, this is what's happening, and I'll keep you informed about it, because there's no real meaning in those kind of things going on behind the client's back. So I kind of adopt that same stance. If I've got a resistant client, I say, look, I totally understand that you hate social workers, if that's the word that you want to use, and that your experience has been really bad. And actually, I don't blame you for being really resistant to that support, because I probably would be too if I had experienced, what you'd experienced. And that kind of sets the tone. The client kind of understands that you understand, and that you're not actually setting high expectations of them, but you're still going to offer the support. So that's usually the kind of tone I would start on if I've got a highly resistant client. I just acknowledge their experiences and that they're really resistant to it, and respect that, and then just say, and we'll just move on from there, and we'll just try and work together in whatever way is most comfortable for them. So yeah, I think transparency, just being open and honest, and sometimes not sugarcoating it, is just the way to do it, and just actually really acknowledging that some of the traumas that young people have experienced, they do feel it's at the hands of social work. Being removed from your family, whether that's for your well-being or not, is going to have lifelong impact, and there's definitely trauma attached to it. So whether that saved their life or changed things for them in a lot of positive ways, they'll always associate that with social work, and there'll always be blame towards that. So it's just acknowledging that the client feels that way and really validating their feelings. I think that's just the best starting point when clients are resistant to working with you.
So you've mentioned quite a few times about clients being resistant at working with you, whether it be like from because of like what you do, the experiences, the traumas of the experience, kind of thing. But I found, and this is just like from supporting and helping my own friends, that if they don't want help, then they're not going to take any help. And so there's almost like you can't help them until they're willing to have that help. Do you find that's the case within social work, or do you think like it's not as bad as that, and eventually people do do accept it and do kind of acknowledge that you're there to support them? Or is it a case of, I don't want to call them like lost cases, but I don't know how else to kind of like describe that situation where they're just a bit like, I'm refusing all help, it's just not happening, it's not for me, but you can see that they could really benefit. Like, how often does that actually happen? Or is there a way to kind of overcome and just get them to realize that you're there for good, besides from being like open and honest? Or is it just a case of open and honest throughout it all?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. I think what you said about, people will only change when they're ready to is 100% the case. Particularly in my role right now with substance misuse, we're there. A big part of our role at the moment is to prevent drug-related deaths, because I don't know whether everyone knows, but there's a massive drug-related death kind of epidemic in Scotland in particular. It's got the highest number of drug-related deaths per capita than anywhere else in Europe, which is really quite shocking. And that number is continuing to rise. I think the most recent drug-related death statistics for the year got released just a couple of months back, and again it was up by about 100 to 150 cases, I think it was. So yeah, obviously in social work, kind of your main aim is to help people achieve behaviour change that they want, that's going to give them a better quality of life. And as you say, we're always in the background because we have that duty of care. If someone's really placing themselves at risk by their choices and maybe an inability to change at that time, it's our role and our duty to kind of be in the background and prevent serious harm. But in terms of meaningful change, yeah, that is only going to happen when the client's ready, because we can give the client all the tools that they need to do that. But if they're not picking up those tools, it's pretty meaningless at that time. So, and you'll do that kind of work with parents and children's services. If you're trying to keep a family together, you're going to try and help a parent to change behaviours and give them the tools to do that. And yeah, the parent has to really want to do that, and any client has to really want to do that. So I think a lot of the time we are responding to crisis and we're trying to prevent worst case scenario situations. So we're kind of a lot of the time this sort of holding space for clients until such time that they're ready to really embrace that support and kind of action it and start working towards the changes that they want. I think you were saying about the traumas and things like that. In terms of that, it is about being consistent. Again, it links back to the resistance to service as well, can link to people's resistance to change, because if they see no value and no point in that service and in changing, they're not going to be motivated to do it. So sometimes just being this consistent person that actually takes, you sometimes get quite unpleasant, treatment from clients. They can be quite rude, they can swear, etc. And I think whilst it's not acceptable, you kind of expect it when you're working with people at their kind of darkest moments and when they're really distressed. So if you maintain your role and kind of evidence your commitment really to the client, that can, whilst it seems like you're not achieving anything and you can start to feel frustrated as a worker because you're just holding crisis all the time, that actually has more meaning than a lot of people probably realise, because especially over kind of a long period of time, that sends a message to the client that actually you are reliable and you're not kind of going to let them down and you're not leaving that situation. Because I think a lot of clients have experienced a lot of attachment issues and letdowns from various people, particularly in their personal life, who ordinarily would be people that would still be there. So it's just about, having that consistent role, being persistent with clients, accepting them kind of at their worst so that they know you're not going anywhere. And that also makes it more likely that they might reach a stage where they're kind of able for change, because they know that consistent person is sort of still there despite all the sort of ups and downs.
During that, you mentioned how you've gone into kind of like rehab work and you're working with like drug use and drug misuse. Now that seems a bit of a jump from going to children care to like preparing them to go into adult kind of like from the care sector to drugs. Like how did you make that jump? Like what made you leave? What encouraged you, to leave that kind of the sector that you were into to this new one?
I think for me, so substance misuse and young people has always been my two kind of main interests at uni. My dissertation was actually on, it looked at children's services and substance misuse services and the kind of intra-agency work in between those and the challenges between social workers, because I think at uni they teach you a lot about the challenges in an interdisciplinary sort of context between the different values of different professionals, whether that's health professionals, social work professionals, but no one really prepares you for the fact that you might actually experience interagency work and challenges with other social workers from other fields. So yeah, that's always been my two areas of interest. And I think substance misuse in my specific caseload in my through care aftercare role was very prevalent. I had a number of cases where there was quite serious substance misuse issues, and so I was kind of exposed to that in my role there in terms of managing risk and kind of reducing harm. So for me, the transition to substance misuse in adults, and I don't know whether this would be the case for anyone coming from through care aftercare, because it's not to say that all young people who have care experience become involved in drugs or alcohol issues. You know, there's a good number who don't, who go on to, you know, achieve their goals and do really well. But I think the ones who have experienced particularly severe trauma and are quite damaged, that can be a route and a kind of cycle that's really difficult for them to get out of, especially if they've got parents and family members and their kind of immediate social circle is really revolving around substance use. It's really difficult for them, even if they've been in care, because a lot of them choose to go back to their families when they leave care. It can be really difficult for them to break out of that. So for me, it didn't feel like too big a jump because I'd had exposure to substance misuse issues in my through care role. But as I say, that was just me and my kind of unique caseload in that role. It's not to say that anyone in a through care role would have a caseload where substance misuse issues would be really as prevalent as they were in mine. So yeah, I think that helped a lot with the transition into my new role, and the exposure I got to kind of adult support protection processes in my through care role really helped as well. Because that's something I'm regularly involved in my current role in terms of kind of protecting adults who possibly have incapacity as a result of their drug and alcohol use. So yeah, I think in social work, a lot of the skills are transferable. I think if you have a genuine interest in people, you'll manage to find interest and kind of satisfaction in any sector, whether that's older adults or children, because, you know, people are people with their own experiences at the end of the day. So yeah, I think it's just using your transferable skills, your kind of softer skills, your people skills and your experiences, and taking that forward to help you engage your new client group. And a lot of the adults that I work with now are actually care experience themselves. So I remember saying to my colleagues when I first started my new role, it's kind of ironic that I sometimes feel like some of the clients that I'm working with now are my previous clients, but 20, 30 years down the line. Not that I would wish that for my previous clients, but where, like you say, some are so damaged and so stuck in these kind of maladaptive cycles, you know, that can sadly be the kind of direction their lives go in. So yeah, I think substance misuse and exposure to children and family social work and being in the care system are really interlinked. So for me, the transition, I could see that, you know, how that related, and it kind of made sense. So the skills, like I say, they were pretty transferable, I think.
And then this is actually going back to one of the previous comments that you made about the rise in drug-related deaths within Scotland in particular. Do you think that was caused by COVID and the lockdowns that we experienced? Do you think that increased the amount of people rather experimenting with or relapsing back into that, because they're not the support network that they were so used to, and like that consistent support network that they had almost dissolved overnight, and everything became online. And like from a mental health impact, it can really, like I know that really impacted a lot of people's mental health. Do you think that could be one of the reasons why drug use kind of went skyrocketed almost with it?
I think COVID definitely has a part to play in terms of the amount of referrals substance misuse and mental health services have received, and the type of crisis work that we're doing. As you say, people have had less support systems in person. A lot of people that maybe have a long-standing drug problem don't have access to the sort of technology that's needed to actually engage in virtual sort of support. So definitely, we have a waiting list at the moment in my current team, which is something that is not kind of been seen before. We're supposed to be a service that can pick people up relatively quickly. From, you know, going from that to a waiting list of over 40 people, it's not comfortable. And I think that is definitely a result of COVID. It's a backlog. And I think housing, you know, health services, everyone is probably starting to feel that they're kind of chipping through that backlog now. I think in terms of drug-related deaths, I do feel like that would have continued to rise, regardless of COVID. That's kind of the drug death statistics in Scotland have kind of been a steady sort of increase for a number of years now. So I think whilst COVID has been really good for people who are involved in the business of dealing illicit drugs, it's allowed them to move through different county lines and things like that very much under the radar, purely because there's less people around to kind of monitor that. So it's definitely had an impact on the supply of substances and things like cuckooing, where vulnerable people's homes are targeted to become involved in the supply of drugs, basically. So it's definitely increased instances like that. But I don't know whether, it could have had something to do with the increase in drug-related deaths, but I do think that it would have continued to increase regardless of COVID, because it is a steady increase that we've seen over the past few years. So we would have liked to have seen it start to go down again, but it's, sadly, it just seems to be continuing to increase that number each year at the moment.
So when it comes to working with like drug misuse, like I'm a big kind of believer in, you need to know what you're doing. Like you need to know what you're supporting with. So for in this case, you need to know the drugs. Do you have to go on like special courses to learn all about the different drugs? Or do you have to like know like the characteristics of them, like what causes them, what they cause in people? So for like certain drugs like cause hallucinations, like do you have to know all this kind of stuff, or is it a case of you're there to support rather than have that understanding?
In my role, there's no kind of specific requirement to have further training, specialized in drugs. Luckily, in my through care role, I had attended a lot of additional training courses around drugs, just because that really benefited me at the time and suited the clients on my caseload. So that obviously has helped in my current role as well. We do work with clinical colleagues, so our community psychiatric nurses who are specialists in substance misuse, they do all the prescribing, and they really have that sort of in-depth knowledge of the different types of drugs, the impact, kind of what the consequences of maybe a certain cocktail of drugs could be. So they kind of hold that sort of clinical and medical knowledge, and we deal more with the social side of things. It's definitely helpful to have knowledge of the drugs that are going about your local area as well, so you know what to look out for, and kind of how drugs can portray themselves when clients are under the influence. And those are things that you kind of learn almost by accident, just through repeated exposure to clients, colleagues, different cases where you are going to see people under the influence at times. For me, the most important training that I kind of went on as soon as I started this role was naloxone training. So for those that don't know, naloxone is the sort of antidote to opiate overdose. So if someone has overdose on an opiate drug, heroin or possibly prescribed opiate medication, naloxone, when injected, will reverse kind of those effects and save someone's life. So I carry naloxone everywhere, because you just don't know, you are going into people's homes and you don't know what you might find at times. And I would hate to be in a situation where I go into someone's home and someone looks like they've had an opiate overdose and I don't have naloxone on me. So I would say that's, that kind of seriously harm reductive sort of training, the basic stuff like naloxone training is, although there's no kind of legal requirement that I know of to have it as a substance misuse social worker, I think everyone should do it. I think police should do it. I think anyone who works in the community should be naloxone trained, but again, that's just a view of mine. So yeah, I think you do build up this knowledge about certain drugs, the different families of drugs, the drugs that are stimulants, depressives, and then you can kind of use that to inform the work that you're doing with clients and the care package that you're making, because obviously you can then take into account what impact the drug that they're taking is having on them. So yeah.
I think it's actually quite interesting how you mentioned naloxone. I've been listening to the radio quite a bit lately. It's been my music as I work away, and there's an advert that comes on the radio at least 3 times a day about naloxone and carrying it, and how it reverses the effects of drugs and all this. And I just think it's quite interesting how I've recently started listening to the radio. That's been coming up. You've just mentioned it there, but it's one of those things that, like, on the radio they are encouraging everyone to carry it around, and it can reflect. It could be a reflection on the fact that Scotland is kind of at a higher end of drug misuse at the moment. But I want to kind of move on now. You've spoken a lot about how you've been supporting lots of different people, like from kids to preteens, young adults. What support is there for you? Because this can't be easy. Like, you're going in, you're hearing these horrible stories, seeing these horrible situations. Is there a lot of support out there for yourself and for other social workers to just even speak something over and get something off your mind? I'll let you tell me about that.
Yeah, so normally, like ordinarily in a social work role, you obviously have your supervisor who's either a senior social worker or your actual line manager who manages your team. So you would get supervision one-to-one with your supervisor or your manager. And again, you can go through case discussions, get a bit of advice and guidance, on bits that you're struggling with, and then maybe a bit of time at the end of your supervision to discuss things that you're maybe struggling with emotionally. I think my first supervisor in my first role, she was really in tune with that, and she was really mindful and aware of, especially as a newly qualified worker, the caseload I had was quite intense at times, and she was pretty good at being mindful of that and actually encouraging you to discuss how that's impacting you emotionally. Because I think as workers, we become so kind of focused on helping our clients that we repress the impact it's having on ourselves in order to still be a functional worker and kind of give the best service to our clients. So she was quite good at helping to stay in tune with that and make sure you felt supported. I think it differs in different teams, the amount of supervision that you get and how it's structured. I think you learn pretty quickly as a social worker what style of supervision works best for you, and you can kind of, I usually go to supervision with an agenda of my own, and I try and kind of work that alongside the agenda that my supervisor has, so that I don't feel like anything's going, unaddressed basically, and I feel like there's an opportunity to discuss things that are maybe niggling away and kind of need to be discussed. Most supervisors are pretty good as well. If you're really at crisis point, it's a case of picking up the phone and saying, I'm struggling with this, can I get some advice and guidance? And they can be pretty good there as well. I think the other great thing I find with social work is, touch wood, I'm yet to be in a team, that's on placements and in practice, where I've felt that my colleagues were not warm or nice. I feel like I've been really lucky in that everyone I've come across in social work and similar sort of areas of work are usually, the type of people generally that go into this job, you would hope, are quite warm, friendly, compassionate people. And you often find that the same compassion that your colleagues show to their clients and in their work, they show that to their colleagues as well. So normally teams are really supportive, and your colleagues can be kind of your best asset in terms of supporting you if things are getting emotionally difficult as well. So that's one thing that I think a lot of people miss. Well, I was lucky because I kind of got 1 year of normality and working in the office and pre-COVID, and then now it's bizarre to think that I've been working longer from home than I have in normal kind of circumstances. So you definitely miss that, having that ability to bounce off your colleagues, and after coming off a difficult call, being able to turn to someone and say, was that okay? Can I talk this through with you? You don't get that when you're working from home. So definitely there's an increase in emotional kind of strain there at times, because you're very much alone, and obviously the nature of your work is highly confidential, so it's not like you can go next door to your neighbour and be like, can I have a chat about this, or go down to your mum or whoever you might live with. So at times in COVID you can kind of feel like you're carrying sort of those loads alone, but if you've got a good team and you've kind of got that lines of communication quite established, like we have a weekly hub where we just for an hour catch up, discuss things, and it's things that you would do kind of every morning, for 10 minutes. You would maybe have a catch up with your colleagues, and you don't get that anymore when you're working from home. So it's making that time, because those things are really important in kind of preventing staff burnout, stopping people going off sick for prolonged periods of time due to stress. So it doesn't seem like an important thing, but prioritizing little things like that, like continuing to have those huddles with your colleagues and communicate and supporting each other, is much more important than you probably realize and when you're doing your day-to-day work.
Amazing. And we're actually just down to our final question here, well, from me anyway. What is the final piece of advice, or what would you say to our inspiring social workers out there, those who are still students, those who are having career change? What would you say is like some key advice that you would like to give, or something you'd like to share with them with the next steps to their journey?
I would say try not to lose sight of why you started, and always keep things under a bigger perspective. I think it can be, you know, once you graduate and you start and you're qualified and you're no longer in this kind of safety bubble of being a student, or even for me, you know, after your first year, you can no longer say you're newly qualified anymore. I can't hide behind that now either, because I'm 2.5 years in now. So yeah, I would say it can be easy to become burnt out in a job that's so emotionally taxing. So just don't lose sight of why you started, and always try and look at the bigger picture, because there can be long periods of time where you feel like, God, I'm not making any leeway with anyone. I feel like I'm putting my everything into these clients and nothing is happening. No one's taking me on. But it's, you know, if I mean, for me, I've only been in practice 2.5 years. Even that's not enough time for a lot of people to actually start even making meaningful change. So it's you have to look at it as a person's whole life course and the impact you have in that time. You know, you often see cases where they've had the same social worker for a really long time, especially in children's services. They often make a much smoother transition, for example, out of care or out of service, because they've had that consistency. So yeah, don't expect change or kind of reward to happen in a short period of time. It's slow, and that's okay, and it's a long process, but just don't lose sight of the end goal. Because yeah, I think if you don't have hope in social work, then you have nothing. Like, you have to believe that even the most volatile and aggressive and what might seem like hopeless kind of people can't change. If you believe that, then your work is meaningless. So you always have to have hope and just not lose sight of the bigger picture. Because clients will pick up on that as well. If they feel you're not genuine and you don't have that belief and that sort of genuine interest and passion, they're going to be less likely to bounce off of you and actually respond to the support that you're given. So yeah, definitely don't lose hope and just keep the bigger picture in mind, for sure.
I think that was lovely, and I think that could be something that we can actually all live by in our everyday lives as well. Like, I think hope, it's something that we all need in our lives. But thank you so much, Joanna, for sharing kind of like your experience from choosing to be a social worker, going through the uni and doing it, and then coming out the other end and where you've kind of ended up now. I do think it's quite strange. It never clicked with me that you would have only had 1 year's actual in-person experience. It's all been online and virtual since then. I do forget that we've basically lost a whole year there, but no, thank you so much for coming along today and speaking to us about your journey. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for attending as well.